Freedom did not start for me with bright sky and open road. It started with blood on my hands and a cotton hoe slick with another man's skull. On a freezing January night in 1852, I stood in the overseer's doorway at Cedar Ridge Plantation, staring at Samuel Blake's broken head, and knew I had just killed the man who thought my life belonged to him. My name is Moses Cain, 28 years a slave on Middle Tennessee soil, 15 of those bent over Master Hartwell's cotton. I always believed I would die in those fields or under the whip. That night I understood there was one more road. Hunted in the mountains, maybe, but hunted as a free man. I step outside. Winter air slaps my face. Up the hill, the big house is burning. Flames climb the white columns and bite into the roof. The proud mansion that showed travelers Master Hartwell's power now looks like a torch held against the dark. Smoke rolls low over the cotton, the same fields where my back has ached since boyhood. I hear glass breaking and horses screaming. I have swung this hoe every day, but never for my own cause until now. Killing a white overseer means rope and slow death. No one has to tell me what will come if they catch me. So, while the house burns, I make my first free decision. They will not take me alive. Down in the quarters, the iron bell rings wild. Children cry. Women shout names. Men stand with their faces turned to the fire, eyes wide. Some drop to their knees and pray. Others just stare at the burning house that has ruled every hour of their lives. They do not know yet that one of their own lit the sky. I keep to the shadows on the packed dirt path. 15 years I have walked this ground in chains and rope. Tonight, I walk it for the last time. Master Hartwell's voice cuts through the noise, higher than I have ever heard it. I made sure his family could get out before I set the flames. Not out of kindness, but plan. Dead masters bring armies. Live ones bring questions and shame. At the edge of the quarters, old Sarah steps in front of me. 10 days ago, Blake beat her bloody for working slow. The yellow bruises still stain her face. Her eyes drop to the small pack on my shoulder, then to the pistol at my belt. She understands at once. "Moses," she croaks. "You going?" "I got to," I say. "Ain't nothing left here for me but the rope." She grabs my wrist, fingers like twigs but hard as iron. "Then you run. Don't you let them lay hands on you again. Not never." For a heartbeat, I almost pull her with me. I want to shout for everyone to follow, to flood the dark fields with running feet. But I have been planning 10 days. Since Blake's last beating cracked my ribs and my fear together. I have enough food for one man. I cannot carry a whole people with me into that cold. Freedom, tonight, is a door only one man can step through. "I'll send word if I can," I whisper. "If I live up there, I won't live just for a day." She lets go. Behind us, part of the roof falls in with a roar, throwing sparks into the sky. The dogs in the back pen start to howl. Soon they will smell more than smoke. That sound snaps me loose. I turn and run. I pass the stump where men were tied to be whipped, the tool shed where the hoe in my hand used to wait for me each dawn, the wagon ruts that lead to the road. Beyond the far fence the land dips, then rises toward the dark line of the Smoky Mountains. All my life those ridges have been the edge of the world. Tonight they are my only hope. For 10 days I have watched and listened. I marked where the creek runs and where the woods thicken, carefully. I stole a pistol and a few cartridges, a knife, flint, a sack of cornmeal, one blanket. Anything more, and someone would have noticed. Now, at the fence, I slip through the gap I made yesterday and drop into the pasture. Frost crunches under my feet. The barking grows sharper behind me. Men shout, but they run to the pasture. Fire first. After that, they will remember the tall slave who would not bow. I keep low and move fast. Every clear print is a message to the men who will track me. I try to leave no message at all. Most runaways hide a few days in woods or barns and pray someone kind will send them north. Then the dogs find them. The riders drag them back, and the whipping writes failure into their flesh. I have seen their backs and faces. I know that ending better than I know the stars. I am not running to hide. I am running to disappear. The pasture ends at a thin screen of brush. Beyond it, the first trees rise, black against the pale sky. The mountains behind them are darker still, a wall of shadow. Somewhere up there are caves, rock ledges, streams that do not freeze solid. Somewhere a man with a gun can see others coming long before they reach him. When I reach the first pine, I stop and touch the bark. The fire behind me is only a dull glow now, a smear of red on the low clouds. The noise of Cedar Ridge fades. The night in the trees sounds different, an owl's call, a small animal in the leaves, the low sigh of wind sliding down from the ridges. Lord, I whisper into the dark, if you still look at men like me, watch this. I ain't asking you to stop their bullets or blind their dogs. Just see what one slave does when he decides he'd rather die on his feet than live on his knees. The wind lifts, cold and sharp on my face. I pull my blanket tight, shift the weight of my pack, and take my next step, not as Moses the field hand, but as something the South has not met yet. Behind me, Cedar Ridge burns. Before me, the Smoky Mountains wait. Between those two fires, a runaway slave begins the walk that will turn him into the most feared mountain man in the South. I was born into chains, but I was not born into silence. My first memory is not the whip or the field. It is the sound of my mother's voice humming low in the dark of the quarters, a tune without words, something older than English. I remember the warmth of her arm around me, the way her chest rose and fell under my cheek. Then I remember her hand being torn away. I was 5 years old when traders came to Cedar Ridge and took both my parents in the same week. I can still see my father's back as they marched him toward the road, wrists in iron, the sun hitting the sweat on his shoulders. I remember my mother's scream when they pulled her up into the wagon, the way she reached for me until a man shoved her down and shut the gate. That is how life began for me on those 3,000 acres of Middle Tennessee soil, with absence, with the space where my parents should have been. Cedar Ridge was not just a farm, it was a world. The Cumberland River wrapped one side like a brown, slow-moving wall. On the other, the land rose and rose until it became the first shoulders of the Smoky Mountains, blue and hazy in the distance on hot days, dark and sharp against winter skies. Between river and ridge lay cotton, endless, ordered cotton, row after row like white scars on red dirt. At the highest point stood the big house, a proud white building with tall columns Hartwell liked to brag about. Greek revival, he called it, as if the Greek people had asked him to honor them by whipping us. From there, a road curved down past the gin house, the barns, the smokehouse, and finally to the slave quarters, a cluster of rough cabins thrown together on the lowest ground, where rain puddled and summer air sat heavy and foul. Everything had its place. The cotton had its rows, the animals had their pens, the white family had their fine rooms and their piano, and we, the people who made all of it work, had our cramped shacks and the lash. James Hartwell, the man who owned Cedar Ridge and everyone on it, liked to call it order. To guests, he played the part of a gentleman. He quoted the Bible at supper, talked about law and progress, rode into town to sit proud in political meetings. He hosted dinners where lawyers and judges praised his efficient management. I saw their carriages roll up the lane, heard their laughter drift down to the quarters at night. They did not hear the screams when the guests were gone. Hartwell's discipline reached into every corner of our lives. When I was 8, I watched him tie a man to the whipping post until the bark of the tree dug into his chest. The man's crime had been dropping a bale of cotton on a wagon wheel and breaking it. They whipped him until his back was raw meat. Then they rubbed salt into the wounds, so he would remember. I remembered too. By the time I was 10, I was in the fields from sunup to sundown. We planted, chopped, picked, hauled. Cotton dust crawled into our lungs and eyes. The overseers rode the rows, watching from horseback, faces shaded under hats, while the sun cooked us. Before Blake, there had been others, hard men who carried whips like extra limbs. They called it correction. We called it survival to avoid them. Step too slow, you met the whip. Talk back, You met the whip. Looked like you were thinking too much. You met the whip. I learned early to keep my face blank and my mouth shut. But I did not learn to keep my mind still. With my parents gone, I was raised by the quarters. Old women who had seen 3 masters come and go. Men who had survived the auction block more than once. They were my teachers in everything that mattered. From them I learned how to walk in the dark without tripping, how to tell when rain was coming by the taste of the wind, how to find wild onions and berries along the edges of the fields without the overseer noticing. I learned which plants eased pain, which leaves cooled fever, how to bind a wound when no doctor would come. On Sundays, when work slowed, the older men told stories. Not the stories Hartwell's preacher told in the big house parlor, where we sometimes had to stand in the back like shadows. These were different stories of Africans who had slipped chains and lived in swamps for years, of maroons hidden in southern woods, of men and women who walked north and never came back, except as whispers. Mountains keep secrets. One elder named Elijah told me once, nodding toward the hazy blue line in the distance. Swamps, they suck you in. Rivers carry you where they want. But mountains, if you learn them, they hold you, feed you, hide you. I did not know then that his words were seeding something inside me that would bloom in fire and blood. Cedar Ridge sat in a strange place. Tennessee was slave country, but close enough to free states that rumor traveled fast. We heard about Ohio, about Pennsylvania, about places where no man could be sold like a mule. We also heard about men dragged back from those borders in chains, beaten worse than anything we had seen for daring to touch free soil. Closer to us than those states were the small farms in the hills. Poor, whites who owned no slaves, only thin soil and resentments. Sometimes they came down to trade with Hartwell. Sometimes we saw them at the edge of the property, lean faces watching as we picked. There were moments, small, quick ones, when our worlds crossed. A poor white boy slipped me a crust of bread once, when I was a teenager, his eyes darting toward the big house to make sure no one saw. Another time, an old hillman traded tobacco for pigs and gave one of our elders a look that said he hated Hartwell almost as much as we did. Those glances taught me something important. Not every white person loved the system that owned us. Some hated it, but did not know what to do with that hate. I stored that away, like I stored everything. If Hartwell had known how much I watched, he might have sold me young. I watched the way the river rose and fell with the seasons. I watched where the land dipped and held fog in the mornings. I watched where the fence lines grew weak, where the dogs' chains were old, which gate hinges squeaked and which stayed silent. I watched the sky above the Smoky Mountains every day. Those mountains were like a second master, always there, always watching, saying nothing. In summer they lay pale blue and lazy. In winter they sharpened to jagged dark teeth. When storms rolled in, they caught the clouds and ripped them open. When the air was clear, they seemed close enough to touch. In my mind, they became a question that never left me. What's on the other side? Hartwell knew how to read ledgers and law books. I learned to read the land, but I also learned letters, and that was a more dangerous thing. At 13, I started slipping into the shadows near the big house when Hartwell's children had their lessons on the porch. The tutor, a skinny man with ink-stained fingers, would drone on while the children recited. I could not see the books, but I could hear the sounds. A, B, C. I listened until I could match sound to shape in my mind. Later, I stole scraps of newspaper from the trash heap behind the kitchen. Torn pages, smeared ink. I hid them under floorboards in the quarters. At night, when the others slept, I traced the letters with my finger and whispered the words, pressing them into memory. Sometimes one of the older men who had picked up a little reading on another plantation would help me, piecing sentences together like broken bones. Words opened a new kind of sight. I read about elections, wars, banks failing in far cities, about laws that tightened around people like me. I read about abolitionists in the North and slave catchers who chased fugitive bodies for money. Print told me what the white world said about us. It taught me how they thought. By 18, I stood 6 feet tall, shoulders broad from years of picking and hauling. My hands were hard as river stones. My back was a map of scars. Among our people, men and women started to look to me when fights broke out, when someone needed lifting, when hard work had to be done fast. I did not ask to lead. I simply did not look away. If a child fell under a wagon, I was the one who ran to drag them clear. If the well went foul, I was the one who waded into the mud to clean it. When the elders argued, I listened to both sides and spoke soft, trying to calm the fire instead of feeding it. People noticed. Even the overseers noticed. "That boy thinks too much," I heard one say once, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Walks like he's got somewhere else to be." He was right. My body belonged to Cedar Ridge, but my mind had already begun to walk the mountains in my sleep. Hartwell's wealth grew with each season. More bales, more acres, more men in town tipping hats to him. As his power grew, his fear did too. He knew slaves outnumbered whites on his land 3-1. He knew that one spark in the right place could turn his fine Greek columns into ash. So he answered that fear with more iron, more leather, more men like Blake. I did not become dangerous to them the night I killed the overseer. I became dangerous long before. When the boy who watched the mountains learned to read words meant for white eyes and listened to old men talk about swamps and freedom. I became dangerous when I realized every order Hartwell imposed was built on the belief that we would never dare to break it. For 28 years, Cedar Ridge tried to turn me into something simple. Hands to pick, a back to bend, a number in a ledger, the land, the elders, the scraps of paper, and the mountains refused to let that happen. They made me something else. They made me a man who could look at 3,000 acres and see not just a prison, but a map. A man who could look at the hazy blue ridge on the horizon and see not just beauty, but cover, caves, and high ground. A man who could look at Hartwell's order and understand it was nothing but fear arranged in straight lines. When Blake arrived, with his dead eyes and his heavy whip, he did not walk into a field of broken people. He walked into a land that had been training one man for 28 years to know every ditch, every tree, every weakness, every possibility. He walked into a plantation that had already, without knowing it, built its own destroyer. And that destroyer was me. The breaking point did not arrive like thunder. It came quiet, slow, and cruel, spread across years like rot under bark until the day the rot gave way and everything fell. The man who pushed me there was named Samuel Blake, the overseer, hired in 1850 when Master Hartwell decided Cedar Ridge needed a firmer hand. That meant someone mean enough to frighten the frightened, someone whose pleasure came from hearing skins split under the whip. I remember the first time I saw him. He rode into the yard with dust on his boots and a pistol at his hip, lean and long like a hungry hound. His face was pale and freckled, his mouth always curled just short of a smile. The slaves working near the barn went still as statues. We'd all seen overseers before, but something in this man's eyes told us he didn't see us as people or even property, just targets. By the end of his first week, he'd whipped 3 men bloody for talking too slow. By the end of his first month, 1 woman miscarried after being beaten in the fields. He walked with a swagger that came from power granted by someone else's cruelty. Hartwell loved him for it. "You've restored order," he'd say. "Keep these blacks sharp, Blake. They respect pain more than kindness. But pain is not respect. It's only fire waiting for dry wood." I kept my head low and my mouth shut, same as I'd done since boyhood. Blake noticed that. He didn't like it. Men like him prefer screams and tears. They make him feel tall. I gave him nothing. That silence burned him worse than words ever could. "Cain!" he'd spit, calling me by the name Hartwell's. Ledgers wrote beside my worth. "You think you better than the rest, don't you? Look at me when I talk." I'd lift my eyes slow, not too long, just enough. "No, sir." He'd stare, waiting for fear to show. Sometimes he found it, sometimes he didn't. Either way, I was marked. He worked me harder than the others, sent me to clear the roughest patches of land, to haul logs twice my weight. When I finished, He'd find a reason to say I did it wrong. The whip followed. 15 lashes. 20. I learned to bite my tongue until blood filled my mouth so he wouldn't get the satisfaction of a scream. What he didn't understand was that every stroke he gave me hardened something inside. Pain lost its mystery. The first lashes burn like fire. After enough, they just hum through bone and nerve until only anger remains. The quarter at night carried that anger like smoke. We whispered about Blake the way children whisper about ghosts, half in fear, half in hunger for justice. Old Elijah said, "Man like that don't die natural." He was right, though none of us said so out loud. By the winter of 1851, Cedar Ridge felt like it was waiting for something to break. The harvest had been poor. Hartwell blamed us, not the rain. He ordered longer hours, less food, more whippings. Men stumbled in the fields. Women fainted. The air was thick with despair. And then came Sarah. Sarah was 60 years old if a day, skin wrinkled like river bark, hands so calloused they looked carved from wood. She'd raised half of us from children. When someone got sick, she knew which roots to boil. When someone died, she sang them home. She was the heart of the quarters. The only mother I had left after my own was sold away. That January morning, frost clung to the cotton stalks that hadn't yet been cleared. The air cut through our clothes like knives. Blake rode down the row, his whip coiled like a snake on his saddle. He saw Sarah struggling with a heavy basket and barked at her. "Move, old woman. The sun's up, and you're still crawling like you're asleep." She mumbled something, probably just, "Yes, sir." But he didn't care. He swung down from the horse and yanked the basket from her hands. Cotton spilled into the mud. "Lazy sow!" he shouted, and before anyone could breathe, the whip cracked. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound carried across the field like gunshots. I dropped my basket and ran toward her before I even knew what I was doing. The others froze. We weren't supposed to interfere. Interfering meant dying. But all I saw was Sarah's body bent double, her thin shoulders shaking as Blake raised the whip again. "Stop!" I shouted. He turned, eyes wide that a slave had dared speak. "You best stay out of this, boy," he growled. "You want her share too?" I stood between him and Sarah, chest heaving, hands shaking but steady enough to make my choice clear. "She's too old. You'll kill her." Face went red. "Then I'll start with you." He swung the whip, and it caught my cheek like fire. I didn't move. He swung again. I caught the leather in my hand, pain exploding up my arm, and pulled. For a second, both of us stood frozen, him holding one end, me the other. Then I jerked hard, and the handle flew from his grip. It landed in the dirt between us. I saw the flicker in his eyes then, the disbelief, the rage. He went for his pistol, but I was faster. I shoved him back, and the gun fell. We didn't fight long. He slammed his fist into my ribs. I doubled but stayed standing. When I raised my head again, his expression had changed. He realized the others were watching. 50 men and women, tools in hand, eyes burning. He knew that if he pushed too far now, if he killed me in front of them, he might not live to reach his horse. He spat in the dirt and hissed, "You'll pay for this tonight." Then he walked away, leaving the whip in the mud. Sarah was half unconscious. I carried her to the quarters myself, ignoring the pain in my ribs. She lived, but the bruises ran black from her neck to her knees. That night, Blake kept his word. He came for me after supper, 2 field hands with him, both scared to disobey. They tied me to the post outside the barn, stripped my shirt, and waited while he uncoiled a new whip. He didn't speak this time, just went to work. The first lash split my back open. The second dug deeper. By the 10th, my breath came in short bursts. By the 20th, the world had gone white. When he finally stopped, I was barely conscious. My body hung limp from the ropes. Blake leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey. "You think you can stand against me?" he whispered. "Next time you talk back, I'll flay you alive." He left me there until dawn. The stars turned above me. clear and cold. I remember thinking I'd die before sunrise, that maybe that was mercy, but something in me refused. I counted every heartbeat. Everyone said the same thing: never again. It took 3 days before I could move without screaming. Sarah came to wash my wounds with salt and boiled leaves. "You ain't dead," she murmured. "So you still got choices." And I did. I could go back to the fields and wait for Blake to kill me slow, or I could kill him first. I began to plan. It started small. I watched his habits, the way he rode the property at night, the cabin he slept in apart from the others, the bottle he drained before bed. I noticed how often Hartwell rode to town, leaving Blake in charge. I learned which door creaked, which didn't. I stole nothing big at first, just a flint, some thread, a spoon I shaped into a small blade. When Hartwell's son broke a pistol, I cleaned the pieces and kept one spare ball hidden. 10 days. That's how long it took for pain to turn into purpose. Each night I lay awake, staring at the roof beams, feeling the scabs on my back crack open when I breathed. I remembered my mother's cry, my father's back, Sarah's bleeding hands, the faces of children born to chains. Every memory sharpened like the edge of the hoe I used in the fields. I told no one, not even Sarah. Secrets shared are secrets lost. By the 10th day, I knew the overseer's rhythm like my own pulse. He always drank himself to sleep, always snuffed the lantern halfway through his bottle, always left the pistol on the table beside his bunk. That night, when the others lay silent and the dog's barking faded, I rose. My ribs still hurt, but the pain felt distant, almost clean. I took the hoe, the same one he'd made me use to dig trenches for the cotton rows. I'd sharpened it quietly on stones all week. The moon was thin, the air biting cold. I crossed the yard like a shadow. His cabin door was half open, the hinges oiled. I stepped inside, slow. He was sprawled on the cot, snoring, a candle guttering low beside him. The smell of whiskey and sweat filled the room. I looked at his face one last time, not a man, just a collection of cruelties wearing skin. I thought of Sarah's blood on the ground. Then I swung. The first blow crushed his skull. The second ended his breath. For a heartbeat, I just stood there, hoe dripping, heart pounding so loud I could hear it echo. Then I turned, struck flint to lantern oil, and tossed it onto his blankets. Fire caught quick. Outside, I could already see the glow climbing toward the big house. That was the night Samuel Blake died. That was the night Moses Cain stopped being a slave. When the fire began to swallow Cedar Ridge, I did not look back. Some say freedom is a sunrise for me. It was smoke rising behind me in the dark. The hoe still felt warm in my hands, sticky with blood, and my heart was beating like a hammer against my ribs. I ran until my legs turned to water, and the world around me blurred into trees and shadow. The sky was low, clouds heavy, the stars drowned in their own cold light. Somewhere behind me, dogs howled. Somewhere closer, I heard shouts, the clang of the plantation bell, the desperate alarm of a master who realized his kingdom was burning. I crossed the pasture, climbed the fence, and dropped into the ravine beyond. The ground there was frozen hard, a skin of ice over mud. I slipped once, caught myself on a root, and kept moving. The forest ahead looked endless good. I wanted endless. I wanted gone. Each breath burned my throat, and the pain in my ribs flared every time my boots struck the earth. But pain was nothing new. I had carried it all my life. What I had never carried before was the weight of my own choosing. When I reached the tree line, the noise from the plantation was just a dull echo. I could smell the smoke on the wind, feel the heat of the flames even at that distance. The wind blew from the north, cold and sharp, whispering through the trees like 1,000 quiet voices saying, "Go, go, go." I went. The first few miles were a blur. My only thought was distance. Every step between me and Cedar Ridge was a piece of life I was stealing back. The ground rose and fell. The trees thinned, then thickened again. Branches clawed at my face and clothes. I didn't stop to wipe the blood. By the time dawn broke, the light came gray and weak through the branches. My legs were trembling, my breath ragged. I found a hollow under a fallen oak, crawled inside, and lay there shaking. The hoe was still in my grip. I buried it in the dirt beside me like it was part of me. Maybe it was now. Sleep came in jerks and snatches. I dreamed of fire and whips, of faces watching from the flames. When I woke, the sun was high. The woods around me were quiet except for the far-off tapping of a woodpecker. I sat up slow, every bone complaining, and listened. No dogs, no shouting. Maybe I'd bought myself a few hours, maybe a day. But I knew better than to believe I was safe. Slave catchers rode hard, and Hartwell had money. He'd send men into the hills with horses and guns, and they'd follow my tracks until they found me or lost me to the mountains. That meant I had to move, and I had to learn fast how to move without being found. That first day taught me what hunger really was. I'd brought a sack of cornmeal, but no pot to cook it. No water but what I could find in the creek. I mixed a little meal with snow and chewed it raw. My stomach twisted, but I kept going. The mountains rose higher with every mile. By nightfall, the ground was steep enough to make my calves scream. I stumbled once and fell hard against a rock, splitting my lip. I tasted blood and laughed out loud, not from joy, but from disbelief that I was still alive. I found a small cave near a stream and crawled inside. The air inside was damp and smelled of earth. I tore a strip from my shirt and bound my ribs tighter. Then, I built a tiny fire, hidden deep in the cave where the smoke wouldn't rise straight up. I used flint and kindling stolen from Cedar Ridge, coaxing the spark until it caught. The light flickered on the walls, painting them red and gold like the fire that had freed me. I sat there watching the flame and listening to the water outside. Every sound made me twitch. A branch breaking, a bird's cry, the rustle of something moving through leaves. Any of it could be men, dogs, guns. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept seeing Sarah's face, her bruises, the look in her eyes when she said, "Run." I wondered if she saw the fire from her cabin, if she knew I'd made good on the promise we never spoke aloud. When morning came, I doused the fire and moved again. The cold bit through my clothes. My breath turned white in the air. My hands were cracked and bleeding, my feet numb. Every few hours I checked the ground behind me for tracks. Snow helped hide my trail, but it also slowed me down. By the third day, I was starving. The cornmeal was nearly gone. I found frozen berries and gnawed them. I followed deer tracks for hours, not because I hoped to catch one, but because they led me toward water. The stream I found was half ice, half running silver. I knelt and drank until my belly hurt. It was then, crouched by that stream, that I truly saw the mountains for the first time. They were huge, alive, their peaks shrouded in fog. The air around them felt different, older, wilder, colder. Down below, I had always seen them as a wall. Up close, they looked like something else, a fortress built by God and time. I thought of Elijah's words, "Mountains keep secrets." I hoped he was right. That night, I built a better fire pit, deeper and narrower, so the light wouldn't show. I found a few dry sticks and shaped them into crude traps, though I doubted they'd catch anything. Still, doing something kept my hands from shaking. Days blurred together. Hunger made my thoughts slippery. Once, I thought I heard dogs again and nearly threw myself into a ravine just to end the chase. But it was only wind. Another time, I dreamed that Blake's burned face was crawling toward me through the snow, his mouth still cursing. I woke, swinging my knife, heart pounding. By the fifth day, I knew I couldn't just hide. Hiding was dying slow. I needed food, shelter, firewood, a way to live, not just survive. So I watched the land. I studied how the water moved, where the deer paths crossed, where the rocks formed natural walls. I found a cave high above a creek bend, deep enough that a man could stand inside. The entrance was hidden by vines and an overhang of stone. That became my first home. I built a rack for drying meat I didn't yet have. I carved sticks for snares, learning by failure no catches, broken cords, empty traps. On the seventh day, luck finally turned. A rabbit blundered into one of my loops. I killed it quick, skinned it with my knife, and roasted the meat over a small flame. It was the first real food I'd eaten since the night of the fire. I remember the taste even now, wild, smoky, pure. I chewed slow, half afraid I'd wake to find it gone. That night, full for the first time in days, I sat by the fire and thought of what I'd done. I'd killed a man, burned a plantation, stolen my own life from a system built to crush it. And yet, sitting there with smoke curling toward the cave roof, I felt no guilt, only clarity. For 28 years, every breath I took had belonged to someone else. Every scar on my back had been another man's signature. Now, for the first time, I was mine. The thought scared me more than the dogs ever did. Freedom was heavy, heavier than chains, because it meant every choice that came next was mine alone. As the fire burned low, I made a promise to the darkness. I would not crawl back. I would not be dragged alive. If they came for me, they would have to fight for every inch. I didn't know yet that I would become the nightmare they whispered about, that my name would carry across counties like a curse and a prayer. I only knew this: the mountain had taken me in, and I would learn to be part of it. I would learn to move like wind through trees, to vanish like smoke, to fight like the land itself. That was the night the fugitive became the beginning of something else, something fierce, something free, something the South would never forget. That was the night Moses Cain was born again, not as a slave, not as a man hunted, but as a shadow among the peaks, a ghost with fire in his hands and no master left on earth. The mountain did not welcome me. It tested me. For weeks I lived between frost and hunger, sleeping in caves and hollow trees, waking to the sound of my own breath and the groan of ice cracking on the stream. Every sunrise meant one more day stolen from men who wanted me in chains or dead. Every sunset meant another night wondering if they were out there, rifles ready, waiting for my firelight to give me away. I learned quick that the mountain was no gentle savior. It fed the strong and buried the weak. The wind here spoke in another language, sharp and cruel. It cut through cloth and skin like memory through a scar. I listened, though. I listened because the wind told me what to do. It told me which hollows held warmth, which slopes caught the sun, which valleys carried sound too far. The first real storm came in February. Snow fell for 3 straight days, heavy and wet, bending trees to the ground. My cave grew colder with each hour, until even the fire barely warmed my hands. When the wood ran out, I tore apart part of my own shoes to burn the leather. I remember holding my palms over the small flame and whispering, "Don't die now. Not after all that." By the 4th morning the sky cleared, but I could hardly move. My fingers were cracked open, the skin on my feet bleeding. I tried to walk and fell in the snow. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind hooves. I rolled onto my side. Down the slope below me, 2 riders moved slow along the creek. They carried rifles and wore long coats. Slave catchers. Even at that distance I knew the look. One white, one mixed, both scanning the ground. I slid back into the brush and lay still until they passed. My heart beat so loud I thought they'd hear it through the snow. When they were gone, I knew I had to move deeper. I couldn't stay close to the valleys. They'd follow the water because every runaway needed to drink. So I climbed higher into the ridges where the rocks broke through the earth like bones, where even the dogs would have trouble finding scent. That night I found another cave, smaller but tighter, with dry moss on the walls. I made a fire, small as a candle flame, and warmed my hands. I told myself I'd rest only a few hours, but exhaustion took me like a wave. I dreamed of Cedar Ridge again, only this time the house wasn't burning. Blake stood on the porch, alive, calling my name. When I turned, the whip was in my hand, not his. I woke shaking, sweat cold on my skin. The cave smelled of smoke and fear. That dream told me something. Running was not enough. The fear would keep finding me. same as those riders. If I wanted to live free, I had to build a life they couldn't destroy. I had to become someone they feared more than I feared them. The chance to start came a month later. It was early March. Snow still clung to the ridges, but the lower woods had begun to thaw. I'd set traps near the creek and was checking them when I saw footprints, fresh ones coming from the east. They were not hunter's boots. Too small, too uneven. A man walking without rhythm. Staggering, I followed the prints cautiously, rifle raised. After half a mile, I found him collapsed beside a fallen pine. Black skin pale with cold, wrists rubbed raw from old shackles. He was breathing shallow, lips cracked. "Brother," I said, kneeling beside him. He startled weakly, eyes wide. "Don't kill me," he croaked. "I won't," I said. "You alone?" He nodded, then coughed until blood came up. "Been running 3 days. They sold me south. I jumped the wagon at night." His name was Jacob, 26. Strong once, but nearly frozen now. I dragged him to my cave and wrapped him in the blanket I'd made from deer hide. I melted snow for water and fed him a handful of dried meat. For 2 days he drifted between sleep and fever. On the third, he sat up, eyes clearer. "You're Moses Cain," he said. "Word about you reached the quarters. Said you killed the overseer and burned the house." I froze. "Who told you that?" "Everyone. They say you disappeared into the mountains, that the masters send men up here but none come back." He looked around the cave, small smile twitching. "Didn't think I'd find you alive." "I ain't a ghost yet," I said. He laughed weakly. "Then maybe you could use another man." That was how it began, the first joining of what would become a band. 2 men hiding from the same hell, learning how to live in a place that wanted them dead but would shelter them if they proved worthy. Jacob had been a field driver once. He knew horses, tools, guns. His back bore more scars than mine, but his spirit was unbroken. Together we hunted, trapped, built better shelter. We learned which valleys the smoke could hide in, which ridges offered good sight lines. At night we talked by the fire in whispers. He told me of plantations burning far away, of rebellions whispered and crushed. I told him my dream that we wouldn't just survive but fight. "Fight how?" he asked. "With what we got," I said. "These mountains, our minds, fear. They think we run to hide. Let's make them wish we had." He stared into the flames a long time before nodding. "Then we start with the hunters." It was his idea. The first strike. A small one. A warning. We'd seen 2 bounty men camping near the foothills. We waited until dark, crept close, and stole their horses. I left a message carved into a tree. "These hills are not yours." The next morning, we heard the shots they fired into the empty forest, cursing the shadows. We watched from the ridge, silent and invisible. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. After that, more came. Slowly, carefully. Word spread through the enslaved quarters, in secret codes, songs sung a certain way. Lines whispered at the river docks. "The mountain man takes in those who dare." By midsummer, there were 5 of us. Me, Jacob, an older man named Abram who had escaped a chain gang, a young woman called Ruth who had fled a trader's wagon, and Caleb, a free blacksmith wrongly accused of theft. 5 souls against a system built on millions. Yet in those woods, we felt like an army. We built new shelters higher up, linked by hidden paths. Each man learned to hunt, to move silent, to shoot. Ruth became our scout. Her eyes saw everything before it saw her. At night we planned. Not big rebellions, we weren't fools, but strikes that mattered. We raided a trader's camp and freed 3 chained men. We ambushed a pair of bounty riders, took their guns and maps. Once, we burned a storage barn belonging to a planter who'd killed 2 slaves the week before. We left another message carved on his door. "The mountain remembers." It wasn't just vengeance. It was warning. Fear spreads faster than fire. Each victory brought food, weapons, and more followers. By winter of 1853, we were 15 strong. Some nights I'd climb to the highest ridge and watch the valley lights, far below plantations glowing like stars fallen into the dirt, and I'd whisper to them, "You don't own the night anymore." But leadership is a burden heavier than chains. I felt it every time I sent someone out on a raid, every time we buried one who didn't return. The mountain demanded payment, for freedom, and it always collected. Jacob once asked me if I ever regretted it, the killing, the blood. I told him the truth. No, I regret waiting so long. Still, I kept one rule: never harm those who had no whip in their hand. We fought masters, overseers, hunters, soldiers, but not farmers scraping by or children sleeping in fear of their own fathers. War has lines, even freedom's war. The mountains became our teacher. Spring taught patience. Summer taught silence. Autumn taught us to store what little we had. Winter taught us who we really were. By 1854, rumor had transformed me into something larger than flesh. Some said I was 7 feet tall, others that I couldn't be shot. Enslaved people whispered my name in the fields, a prayer against despair. Masters spoke it as a curse at their dinner tables. The fear itself was worth more than any bullet. One night, while the wind howled outside our cave, Jacob said quietly, "You know, they're calling you the devil of the Smokies." I smiled. "Good. Let the devil stand for freedom then." He nodded. "Long as he stands." I looked at the fire, at the shadows it cast against the walls, and I realized something. The fire didn't belong to either of us anymore. It belonged to the story, and the story was already walking out into the world ahead of us. The hunted had become the hunter. The slave had become the mountain's sword. And the South, though it didn't know it yet, had just declared war against a man who would never kneel again. By the time the year 1855 came, my name was no longer mine. It had turned into something else, a sound whispered in the fields and spat out in fear around the hearths of masters. Moses Cain. They said it like a curse, but among the enslaved, it sounded like a prayer. What began as 2 men hiding in the hills had become a chain that reached from one end of Tennessee to the other. Each month brought new faces, runaways with bleeding feet, free blacks hunted for sport, white debtors running from prison, soldiers who deserted rather than whip another man. The mountain gave them all the same name: fugitive. And I, somehow, had become their captain. We never spoke of rebellion the way the masters imagined it, rows of men charging with torches toward the big house. Our war was quieter, sharper, more patient. A strike in the night, a barn burned, a shipment lost, a hunter vanishing without trace. Every act small by itself, but together they worked like termites in the beams of the South's great house. Hartwell's bounty on my head had risen to $2,000 more than most men would earn in a lifetime. Posters went up in Nashville, Knoxville, even as far as Georgia. Wanted Moses Cain, Negro outlaw, alive $2,000, dead $1,500. They called me extremely dangerous, which for once was the truth. The bounty brought more hunters than bullets could stop. Some came alone, others in groups, drunk on greed. A few never made it past the foothills. We set traps on the trails, shallow pits covered with brush, snare lines that pulled riders from their saddles. Others we let ride deep before we struck. The mountains favored those who knew her moods. I could hear a foreign step in the woods the same way a man hears thunder before a storm. Every fight was a lesson. We learned to move like ghosts, to fire once and vanish, to let the terrain fight for us. We watched Cherokee hunters who still lived in the high valleys, how they tracked deer without sound, how they built smoke that drifted flat along the ground instead of rising like a beacon. I paid one with venison to teach us which leaves hid the scent of men from dogs. In the valleys, planters began to talk of abandoning their properties near the ridges. They called the Smokies Cain's Hell. Some refused to travel at night. Others armed their slaves and forbade them to sing, as if silence could stop hope. But our hope was not quiet. The raids grew bolder. In May 1855, we struck a coffle of 20 enslaved people being marched toward Alabama. We waited on a narrow road where the forest pressed close. When the traders reached the bend, Jacob gave the signal. A whistle, two short, one long. Rifles cracked like thunder rolling through the trees. Horses screamed. In less than 5 minutes it was done. 2 traders dead, 1 fled into the brush. The freed men and women stood staring, not believing. "You're real," one whispered. I said, "So are you. Remember that." We cut their chains, shared our food, and guided them north until the land flattened toward Kentucky. Some went on to freedom. A few stayed. The mountains had that pull once she took you in. You never wanted the open road again. Every victory carried a shadow, though. For each man we freed, the state sent 10 to hunt us. Tennessee's governor declared we were a band of armed Negro criminals threatening lawful order. Militia units formed in neighboring counties. They called their campaign Operation Restoration. I laughed at the name. What they wanted restored was fear. They didn't get it. That autumn we raided Hickory Bluff, a plantation known for killing runaways. It wasn't just revenge. We needed supplies. Powder, salt, blankets. We hid at dusk, moving through the cornrows with torches wrapped in cloth. When the house caught, its reflection danced on the river like a second fire below. The overseer tried to run. Jacob shot him through the spine. I found Hartwell's cousin, who owned the place, crouched behind his desk with a pistol shaking in his hand. He said, "You Cain? You think you can win this war?" I told him. I already did. Then I left him to the flames. After Hickory Bluff, the bounty rose again, $5,000. Whole towns offered rewards just for information, but rumors moved faster than riders. People said I could disappear into smoke, that bullets bent away from my skin. Even some white men began to believe it. The power of a story is stronger than any musket. I used it the way they used the whip. When we struck, we always left messages, sometimes carved into doors, sometimes painted on stones near the road. The mountain remembers. Justice walks on 2 feet. Do not follow. Each phrase traveled farther than our footprints. Enslaved people whispered them into songs. Planters turned pale hearing their own children hum the tune. Still, I could feel the weight growing. The more we fought, the more I saw how war consumes even the righteous. Ruth, our scout, was shot through the leg during a skirmish. Caleb died, ambushed on a trail. Each loss cut deeper than any lash ever had. I buried them myself beneath cairns of mountain stone and promised each grave we'd make it mean something. One night, alone by the fire, I thought about the men I'd killed. There were many, too many to count without losing my soul. But then I'd remember Sarah and my back and every scream I'd ever heard at the whipping post. The numbers evened out. Jacob once said, "If we keep this up, they'll send an army." "They already have," I told him. "We're the proof." The army came the following spring, 200 militia soldiers under Captain Morrison, the same man who'd hunted the Cherokee decades before. He swore he'd bring my head to Nashville. For 3 months they combed the hills, burning every cabin they found. But mountains have more hiding places than any map can hold. We led them in circles until their supplies ran out. When they turned for home, 20 of their men were missing, and 3 never found at all. That defeat broke their pride. For a season, the ridges were ours again. Freedom tasted different now, not sweet, but earned. It tasted like gunpowder, smoke, sweat, and grief. Yet I wouldn't trade it for all the fine dinners in Hartwell's house. Sometimes, on clear nights, I climbed a peak high enough to see the Tennessee Valley spread below like a map. Lantern lights twinkled in the distance, the same lights that once marked chains and cruelty. I'd stand there with the cold biting my face and whisper, "I am still here." In those moments, I understood that what we'd built was bigger than vengeance. It was proof that their system could bleed, that their fear of us had reason, that one runaway's rage could shake a state. Of course, power draws betrayal the way blood draws wolves. The cracks began to show by late 1857. Some of the new recruits were reckless drunk on the legend more than the purpose. A few robbed travelers without cause. I beat one nearly to death for attacking a farmer's wife. "We ain't bandits," I told them. "We're the answer to a question the world's been too scared to ask." Still, I could feel control slipping, the way snow starts to slide before an avalanche. That winter we raided a depot near Knoxville, taking rifles and powder meant for the militia. It was our greatest prize and our loudest mistake. Newspapers screamed that the Negro Rebellion had captured state property. Politicians demanded revenge. The bounty rose one last time. $10,000. Dead or alive. 10,000. Enough to make even friends start dreaming of gold. I tried to ignore the unease creeping through camp, but the mountain feels everything. Nights grew colder, talk quieter. Men who once laughed around the fire now sat apart, sharpening knives, glancing at one another. I slept lighter, hand on my pistol. Still, I held to faith in what we'd done. The raids had freed over 100 souls. Plantations near the ridges stood half empty. Insurance companies refused to cover slave property within 50 miles of our hunting ground. Whole counties trembled at the mention of our names. Yet I knew a storm was building, the kind that no cave could outlast. Every fight I had ever won, every man I had ever killed, every spark we'd struck in the dark, they were leading to something. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the wind no longer whispered go but prepare. I didn't know it then, but our war was nearing its last chapter. The hunters were gathering. One of them would know our secrets. And the mountain, which had carried me for 7 years, was about to test whether I truly deserved to call myself free. The wind that morning had teeth. It came down from the high ridges, slicing through every gap in the trees, whistling like a warning I should have listened to. We had been planning the Hickory Grove raid for 3 months. Every map, every patrol route, every turn of the river had been studied until I could draw them in the dirt with my eyes closed. Hickory Grove wasn't just another plantation. It was a fortress of cotton and cruelty, 300 acres run by Colonel Preston Yates, a man who bragged he could break a slave faster than a horse. He kept gallows behind his gin house, tall as pride, and he used them often. We'd freed people before, but this was different. Hickory Grove sat deep in the valley where Tennessee's wealth lived. If we could strike there, burn it, and vanish again, it would prove the mountains still ruled over the valley. I had 35 fighters by then. My band had grown from ghosts into soldiers. Jacob stood at my side as always, calm as stone. Ruth limped slightly from her old wound, but moved like smoke when the night covered her. Abram, our elder, handled the powder stores. Even a few poor whites had joined us, deserters who'd rather fight beside the hunted than die guarding a master's field. For weeks we'd watched Hickory Grove from the tree line. Ruth counted the guards. 6 mounted, 4 on foot. We marked the overseer's rounds, the times the dogs were fed, when the lanterns dimmed. The plan was simple in writing and hell in execution. We'd strike at dusk, when the fields emptied, and the white family gathered for supper. Half the group would cut the lines to the slave quarters, arming anyone ready to flee. The rest of us would seize the house, destroy the records, and burn the gin so the cotton could never be sold. Then we'd vanish back into the hills before the nearest town even knew which way to ride. But plans don't breathe like men do. They don't bleed or panic. That part is left to us. The night before the raid, we camped in a gorge 10 miles north. No one spoke much. I sat by the fire sharpening my knife, thinking of how far the road had taken me from the field at Cedar Ridge to this moment where freedom itself seemed to breathe beside me. Jacob broke the silence. "You know, once we light that fire, they'll never stop coming. Not till we're all dead." I looked up. "Then we make it a fire they remember." He nodded once, satisfied. At dawn we moved out. The sky was overcast, clouds bruised and heavy. I took it as a blessing. Smoke hides best beneath gray. We reached Hickory Grove by late afternoon and waited in the woods until the light began to fade. The smell of cotton and manure drifted thick through the air. Somewhere a fiddle played, probably Yates's sons drinking early. The sound carried strange, cheerful, oblivious. When the sun slid behind the ridge, I raised my hand. 35 shadows moved as one. Ruth slipped ahead to cut the lantern lines. Abram and Caleb carried the powder. Jacob and I led the front, crawling through the ditch until the white columns of the big house rose above us like pale bones. I remember the taste of the moment, the metallic tang of fear mixed with the sweetness of smoke from someone's cooking fire. For a heartbeat, I thought of Sarah and the old quarters at Cedar Ridge, the smell of boiled cornmeal, the hum of tired voices at dusk. Then I forced it away. There was no room for ghosts tonight. A dog barked. Another answered. Then silence. Ruth's knife had done its work, I whispered. Now. The first explosion came from the gin house, a dull, heavy thud that made the ground tremble. Flames shot through the roof like the mountain's own breath. Shouts erupted from the yard. Before they could gather, we were already inside the fence. Gunfire cracked. The overseer appeared on the porch, pistol drawn, but Jacob's rifle spoke first. He fell backward, taking the door with him. I kicked through the splinters and entered the house. The air stank of oil and fear. Yates was at the top of the stairs, his 2 sons behind him. He fired once, missed. I didn't. The shot took him in the chest. His sons charged, screaming. One reached me, slashing with a hunting knife. We grappled, stumbled down the stairs, hit the floor hard. The knife glanced off my shoulder. I drove my own into his side. He gasped, eyes wide. More boy than man in that moment. The second son froze, staring. "You'll hang for this," he shouted. "Then I'll hang free," I said, and fired. Outside, chaos ruled. The enslaved had broken their chains and poured from the quarters, some grabbing weapons, others simply running toward the woods. The sky above was a furnace. Cotton bales burned like pyres. Ruth limped out of the barn, blood on her sleeve but a smile on her face. "It's done," she said. "They'll talk about this till judgment." We gathered what we could, guns, ammunition, food, and herded the freed people toward the hills. 60 souls, terrified and trembling but alive. Behind us, Hickory Grove collapsed in on itself, a roaring monument to everything we had endured. By the time the first militia horn sounded from the valley, we were already miles away. For 2 days we moved north, sleeping little, eating less. The freed men and women followed Jacob's lead while I scouted behind. Rain fell steady, erasing our tracks. Still, I knew retribution was coming. A wound that deep doesn't close without blood. It came faster than I thought. On the 3rd morning, a rider appeared on the ridge opposite us, then another, then 20 more. Morrison's militia. They'd been closer than we guessed, the air filled with shouts and musket smoke. "Scatter!" I yelled. "Pairs only." The forest exploded into movement. Bullets tore through branches, screams echoed. I fired twice, saw one man fall, but there were too many. We retreated up a narrow ravine that twisted like a snake between cliffs. At the end lay our trap, a box canyon we'd chosen weeks earlier for this very reason. They thought they had us cornered. In truth, we had them. We took positions along the walls, rifles ready. I waited until the first line of soldiers entered the canyon's throat. Then I gave the signal, a single crow's call. Fire thundered from both sides. The sound was deafening, echoing between rock walls, until it seemed the mountain itself had turned against them. Men fell, horses reared, confusion spread. They tried to climb the slopes, but the shale crumbled under their boots. For an hour the battle raged. Smoke filled the canyon, thick and choking. We fought with rifles until the barrels burned our hands, then with pistols, then with knives. When it ended, 17 militia lay dead, a dozen more wounded. We lost 3. Among the fallen was Captain Morrison himself, the great hunter of men. I found him slumped against a rock, a bullet through his chest. His eyes met mine, disbelief clouding them. He whispered, "You're no man, you're the devil." I knelt beside him. "No, Captain, just a man who finally stopped kneeling. He died with my shadow over him." We buried our dead high in a hollow, marked only by stones. I told Jacob, "They'll come again," he said. "Then we'll be ready again." But part of me knew the mountain was growing weary of war. The ground itself seemed heavy with all the blood it had swallowed. In the weeks that followed, we struck smaller targets, bridges, wagons, storehouses. Every blow hurt them more, yet each victory felt emptier. The faces around the fire grew fewer. Ruth's limp worsened. Abram coughed blood but refused to stop working powder. We'd become ghosts of our own legend. Then came word from a friendly farmer down the valley. The state had doubled the bounty. 300 men preparing for one final sweep through the Smokies. He said they meant to burn every cave, every cabin, every inch of land that had ever sheltered us. I thanked him and sent him away before the fear in his eyes spread to my people. That night I climbed the highest ridge alone. The moon hung thin above the valley. Fires dotted the lowlands plantations, rebuilding what we'd destroyed. 7 years. That's how long I'd been fighting since Cedar Ridge. 7 years since the night I first ran with blood on my hands. I thought of everyone we'd lost. Sarah, Ruth, Caleb, all of them. Freedom had cost more lives than chains ever had. Yet I couldn't regret it. The mountain wind rose again, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. It whispered, "Not go this time. Not prepare, just finish." I knew then the end was coming. Whether by bullet, betrayal, or time, it didn't matter. The story had run its course. I went back to camp and told Jacob, "If they want the mountain, let them have her body. But her spirit will outlive us all." He looked at me for a long moment. "Then we die standing. Always." We clasped forearms. Warriors' promise. 3 weeks later, the hunters found our trail again. A bandit we'd once spared sold us for silver. By the time I realized it, hundreds were already climbing toward our caves. The mountain had kept her secrets long enough. Now she was calling them all home. The morning they found us, the world was made of fog. It hung low in the hollows, thick enough to hide a man, thick enough to hide death. I remember thinking maybe the mountain herself had drawn that mist to give us one last mercy to cover us before the end. We had 30 souls left then. 30 who had survived years of raids, winters, hunger, and loss. Most bore scars. Some limped. A few still carried bullets under their skin. Yet every one of them stood ready when Jacob woke me before dawn and said, "They're coming." His voice was steady, but his eyes told the truth. This time, it wasn't a handful of bounty men or a dozen militia. It was the state. Through the fog, I could hear them, hundreds of boots and hooves echoing in the distance, the dull clatter of rifles against saddles. The sound rolled up the slopes like thunder trapped under earth. "They mean to finish it," Jacob said. "Then we'll let them try." We had chosen our ground well. The cave sat high above the Tennessee Valley, hidden in a cliff that curved inward like a wound in the mountain. Below it, a single narrow path wound upward, steep and slick with moss. To reach us, they'd have to come single file, easy targets for men who knew where to aim. I walked the line that morning, checking rifles, powder, blades. Every face I passed turned to me, waiting. These people weren't slaves anymore. They weren't fugitives either. They were free souls who'd built their own country in the clouds, and they would defend it. "Listen to me," I said, my voice echoing off the stone. "They come here thinking they can end what we started. But freedom doesn't end with a bullet. It ends when a man bows, and we stopped bowing a long time ago. You understand?" A rumble of voices answered me. "We understand." Ruth, her hair gone gray and her legs still stiff, lifted her rifle. "Let them climb," she said. "We'll make the mountain remember us." I smiled. That's all I ever wanted. The first shots came just after sunrise. A scout appeared below, a dark speck in the mist. Jacob dropped him with one clean shot. His body rolled back down. The slope and the echo of that single gunshot told the others exactly where we were. The siege began. For the rest of that day, they tried to advance. We fired from the rocks, our shots cracking through the fog. They fired back blindly, bullets whining off stone. the air filled with smoke until it choked the breath. By nightfall, their dead littered the path. We'd held them off, but at a cost. Abram had taken a ball to the chest and died without a sound. Ruth was bleeding again, her bandages soaked red. When darkness fell, the firing stopped. I could hear their campfires below, the faint murmur of voices, the clink of metal. They were regrouping. Tomorrow they would come harder. Inside the cave, the air was close and heavy. We had little food, less water, and almost no powder left. Still, no one spoke of surrender. We ate what we could, sat in silence, listening to the wind outside. Jacob broke it first. "If we don't make it through tomorrow," I looked at him. "We won't speak that way." But he shook his head. "You should know what comes after. If they kill us, don't let them say it was for nothing. Don't let them bury the truth with us." "They won't," I said. "They can't. Truth don't stay buried long." He smiled faintly. "Then I'll hold you to that." We sat a while longer. Somewhere deeper in the cave, a freedman began to hum a low tune, old and sad, the kind passed down through generations. Soon others joined, their voices weaving through the dark like thread through cloth. It wasn't a battle hymn. It was a farewell. I didn't sleep that night. I sat near the mouth of the cave, watching the valley lights far below. They looked so small, so peaceful, as if the world outside had forgotten there was a war being fought on this mountain. I thought about Cedar Ridge, about Sarah, about my mother's song. I thought about the whip and the hoe and the fire that had started it all. I thought about the faces of every man and woman who'd risked everything just to breathe free air. And I knew then that whatever happened tomorrow, we'd already won. At dawn, the mist cleared. The enemy came in waves, 300 strong, muskets gleaming, flags snapping in the wind. They came with drums this time, as if to remind us that we were fighting not just men, but an army. The first volley hit the rocks around us, sending shards of stone flying. We returned fire, dropping the front line, but more filled their place. The smoke grew thick, the noise deafening. They tried flanking from both sides, but the cliffs protected us. For hours we held, reloading until our fingers bled, shouting to one another through the smoke. I saw Jacob take a bullet to the shoulder and keep firing. I saw Ruth crawling through the dust, dragging extra powder to the line. By afternoon, the sun was high and our ammunition nearly gone. I counted the shots left in my pistol, 3. That was all. "They're falling." "Back!" someone yelled. But they weren't. They were circling, moving higher along a ridge that overlooked the cave. I realized too late what they meant to do. "Back!" I shouted. "Back into the cave." A moment later, a blast tore through the air. The ground shook as cannon fire ripped into the cliff. The cave trembled, dust and rocks raining from the ceiling. Men screamed. Another blast. The entrance collapsed halfway, sealing us in shadow. The air filled with choking smoke. The heat pressed against us. I could hear the soldiers cheering below, thinking it was over. "Are you alive?" I coughed. Voices answered, faint but there. Jacob, Ruth, a handful of others, maybe 10 left. We knew what came next. They'd wait until nightfall, then climb and finish the job. Jacob crawled beside me, blood streaking his arm. "We could still slip out the back tunnels," he said. "No," I told him. "They'll be waiting. We end it here." He stared at me, then nodded, slowly. "Then we make it count." We broke what weapons we had left into pieces of shrapnel, packed the last of our powder into small bundles. If they wanted this cave, they'd pay for every inch. The final assault came at dusk. The sound of boots on rock echoed like thunder. We lit the fuses and waited. When they reached the opening, we threw everything we had: fire, powder, lead. The blasts shook the cave again, lighting the smoke with orange flame. The first line of soldiers vanished in it, screaming. Then the rest came, climbing over the bodies, firing into the dark. I don't remember how many I killed. Too many. Not enough. At some point my pistol emptied. I fought with the butt of it until it broke, then with my knife until that too was gone. A bullet tore through my leg, another grazed my ribs. Still I fought. I saw Jacob fall beside me, his mouth open but no sound coming. I saw Ruth drag herself forward, bayonet in hand, before another shot took her. The cave was a furnace now, lit by fire and blood. My ears rang with the noise, but my heart beat clear and slow, the way it does when a man stops being afraid. I picked up a fallen rifle, drove its bayonet into the nearest soldier, and kept moving. They surged around me, faces pale with smoke and fury. Someone shouted, "There! That's him!" I turned toward the voice and saw a lieutenant raising his pistol. We fired at the same time. His bullet caught me in the chest. Mine caught him between the eyes. The world staggered sideways. My legs gave way. I fell back against the stone, the cave roof flickering above me like a dying sky. I could taste iron in my mouth. Around me, the sounds of battle faded into distance. Somewhere far away, a voice was shouting, "He's down! He's down!" I wanted to laugh, but no air came. Through the haze, I thought I saw the mountain's mouth opening wide, as if to take me home. I whispered to her, "You kept your promise." The cold crept up my body like water. I wasn't afraid. As the darkness closed in, I heard something soft and low, like the hum my mother used to sing in the quarters. For a moment, I was 5 again, curled in her arms before they took her away. Then there was only silence, and the mountain breathing. That was how I died. Not in a field under a whip, but in fire, on my feet, with freedom still burning in my hands. When I opened my eyes, there was no mountain, only light. For a moment I thought I had awakened to morning, but the light didn't move. It was everywhere at once, bright and soft, like fire seen through water. I felt weightless. No pain, no blood, no chains. Then I heard voices, not shouts or cries, but the murmur of many people talking at once, the way wind sounds when it moves through tall grass. Some were voices I knew. Sarah's laughter, Ruth's humming, Jacob's calm baritone, calling my name. Others were strangers, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, rising and falling in waves that wrapped around me like song. That was the first time I understood what it meant to die free. But death doesn't stop a story. It only sets it loose. Down in the valley, the soldiers who had killed me dragged my body into daylight. They wanted proof that the nightmare was over. They tied my wrists and slung me across a mule, parading me down the mountain road. Townspeople lined the path, some cheering, others silent. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their eyes. They carried me to the county seat, a place called Greendale, and laid me out in the courthouse square. There, under the same flag that had once waved over my chains, they announced the end of Tennessee's most wanted man. The crowd pressed forward, curious, frightened, triumphant. A preacher blessed my corpse. A boy tossed a stone. One of the officers lifted my head by the hair to show the bullet. "Whole. This is what becomes of rebellion," he said. "This is what becomes of freedom without permission." But even as he spoke, I felt the lie of his words trembling in the air, because somewhere behind that crowd, I sensed the quiet presence of others' field hands who had walked miles just to see me with their own eyes. They stood at the edges, heads bowed, not in sorrow but in understanding. For them, I wasn't dead. I was proof. They whispered my name like prayer, and so my body became a kind of sermon. They displayed it for 3 days. On the 4th, they buried me on a hill just outside town, unmarked except for a single stone. But the earth there didn't hold silence long. By the next week, people began coming, first the enslaved from nearby plantations, then free blacks from the north, even a few poor whites who'd fought beside us. They left offerings, bits of cloth, broken shackles, flowers stolen from the yards of masters. Each token said the same thing: "You died free, and so shall we." The state tried to erase me after that, Newspapers called me a criminal, a murderer, a thief. They wrote that I'd been possessed by the savagery of my race. Politicians thanked God for my death. Preachers used my story as warning. But stories are wild things. They don't stay where you put them. Among the enslaved, my name changed shape. I became a whisper, passed through songs, a ghost in the hills, a promise. Children were told that when thunder rolled across the Smokies, it was Moses Cain riding again. Mothers sang that the mountains still hid his fire. Even the bounty hunters grew cautious. Many left the profession entirely. They said the hills were cursed, that anyone who hunted too long in Cain's country came back hearing footsteps behind them in the night. Some claimed to see my shadow at dusk, rifle on my shoulder, watching from the ridgeline. Let them see it. Fear has its uses. Years passed. The war came. The same valleys that once sent men to chase me now sent them to die in blue and gray. And when the Union soldiers finally marched through Tennessee, more than one officer told his men, "Remember what Cain did in these mountains. Remember what freedom costs." Some of the survivors from my band fought in those regiments. Jacob's story reached the North through abolitionist papers. He told them about our raids, our caves, our victories and losses. He called us the Army of the Forgotten. After emancipation, he traveled to Canada, where he helped others escape South's grip and told my story wherever people would listen. When he died in 1891, they said his last words were, "Moses is waiting in the high country." I like to believe that's true. By then, Tennessee had tried to forget me again. The plantations were gone, but their ghosts remained men with new names for old chains, laws written to bind instead of whips to bruise. Yet even in those dark times, people still found their way to my grave. In the 1,920 seconds, a group of black veterans from the Great War climbed the hill and placed a marker. They carved the words themselves, letters rough but clear. Here Moses Cain died free after 7 years of mountain warfare against slavery. Freedom requires the courage to die standing. When they finished, they stood in silence. One of them, an old man with a limp, saluted. Then they walked back down the hill, leaving the marker gleaming under the sun. Decades later, the Jim Crow laws tried again to erase me. The marker was knocked down, rebuilt, knocked down again. Each time, people returned to raise it back up. They said the mountain wouldn't let it stay buried. By the 1,960 seconds, the civil rights movement had found my name once more. Students from Nashville drove out to Greendale, read the inscription, and took photos. Some of them carried my story on banners at marches. Moses Cain died free. They said my war was their beginning. I never wanted to be anyone's symbol. I wanted only to live unowned, to feel the weight of my own choices. But maybe that's what a symbol truly is. A life lived so fiercely that it burns into memory. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the modern world, the one that rose from the ashes of everything we fought. I see highways where our trails once ran, towers where trees stood, electric light where we once hid our fires. I wonder if the people who walk those streets ever feel the mountain's breath behind them, reminding them that freedom wasn't given, it was taken. The mountain remembers, always. I can still see her now, even from beyond this veil of time. The ridges rise like waves frozen in motion. The rivers cut deep scars through the valley, silver in the sun. Each stone up there carries a story, a step, a struggle, a heartbeat. The wind that once chilled my bones now carries the songs of descendants who never knew my name but live inside my victory. If you stand on that ridge on a quiet night, you can still hear the echo of rifles, the whisper of prayers, the crackle of fire. But if you listen closer, beneath the noise of war, you'll hear something softer, the sound of breathing, the breathing of a people who refuse to stop. I was born a slave, but I did not die one. I became the mountain's voice, and the mountain, once silent, never forgot to speak. They tried to make me a warning. Instead, they made me a legend. Now, I belong to no one. Not to the history books that misname me. Not to the state that hunted me. Not even to the men and women who loved me. I belong only to the truth that a man can be beaten, broken, hunted, but never truly owned. Freedom is not safe. It is not gentle. It is not granted by kind hands or written into laws. It is carved out of terror and defiance, shaped by blood and belief. It is the single thing worth dying for because it is the only thing that lets you live. So if you ever walk those Tennessee hills and see the fog curl low around the rocks, think of us. Think of Jacob and Ruth and all the nameless who fought beside me. Think of the fire that still burns under the soil. And when the wind brushes your face, know that it carries more than air. It carries memory. It carries warning. It carries promise. I am Moses Cain. I killed to be free. I died to stay that way. And as long as men draw breath in a world that still builds new kinds of chains, I will never be truly gone. The mountain remembers.